Luke Nicholson, hello, welcome onto the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Luke.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have another Luke on the podcast. This is the first time this has ever happened.
Oh, the first time?
Yeah. So from one Luke to another. Yeah, welcome.
Yes.
I was actually wondering, since you work with learners of English like me, and your name is Luke, I was wondering if learners of English ever mispronounce your name or misspell your name.
Well, my favourite pronunciation of my name is by Brazilian Portuguese speakers. Brazilian Portuguese is a language that allows certain consonants at the ends of syllables, and other consonants aren't allowed unless they're followed by a vowel sound. For instance, a k type sound needs to be followed by a vowel, and so we get something like Lukey. Which, of course, is a diminutive suffix in English. So when we say things like, I'm not sure... Teddy, for instance, right, is a diminutive suffix of Ted, little Ted, which then got put onto the bear.
Yeah, my mum and dad used to call me Lukey when I was a little kid. And, you know, I've had the same thing from Brazilian students who put up their hand and after they've, you know, realised that they don't have to call me teacher, they call me Lukey, and it's kind of like, okay, this is a little bit too informal now.
Yes, or for instance, the postman comes and, are you Lukey? Yes,
like,
I am.
Yeah, I didn't realise that you knew me that well. Have you been reading my letters?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, and all right, Lukey from the Brazilians, all right.
From the Bulgarians, you might get Wuk.
Because
as you might be aware, sometimes L's turn into W sounds throughout histories of languages. So, for instance, in French, L's have disappeared and have turned into the letter U you now see in French in certain words, when you have AU, for instance. And then you get, for instance, Polish, you've got that L that has the little slash through it.
Yeah.
That used to be a L sound, but has since turned into a W sound. And in Bulgarian, what's happening right now is that L's are turning into W's, not by everyone, but you'll get people that say a W instead of a L sound. And so my name becomes Wuk. Rather than Luke. Not all Bulgarians do this, but it's something that you hear. When I went to Sofia, I kept saying the word thank you, which has an L in, and I was listening out for other people saying that word.
So you're an accent coach. That's your sort of job title, or that's how you describe yourself on your website. So maybe the place to start here is just to ask you what that is. So what is an accent coach? What do you do?
Well, I primarily help learners of English speak more clearly and more confidently. Sometimes I help actors as well. And when you are looking to speak more clearly and confidently, this is partly to do with intelligibility, and some people divide intelligibility into different bits. But for me, essentially, it's about people understanding you, understanding what you mean, and that involves teaching not only pronunciation, but also listening. And when you're teaching pronunciation, there is no such thing as neutral pronunciation, right? There's no thing that you can teach and say, look, every single person does this in exactly the same way. And in which case, then, in my opinion, the student, or I can guide them, it should choose some kind of model. And it doesn't matter whether you get to that model or not, or it might do. But the idea is this is the direction we're going in when we're improving your intelligibility.
So in terms of a model, do you typically suggest one model in particular? What do you find learners of English, what model do they want, and which model do you think they should aim for?
Well, I don't think there's a should here. It's about exploring options. Primarily, I teach Standard Southern British English. That's my accent. But I'm very aware that there are loads of teachers out there who don't speak like me, which is why I created a UK accent series exploring the differences between accents And rather than me doing all the accents, I found 150 different speakers in the UK and put them in the video and then put their names underneath and where they were from. And this is a resource that I hope English teachers can use or students can use when they're searching for a model. Now, of course, I didn't do it for the whole of the English-speaking world, right? This took months of my time.
Yeah.
But the idea is that you can go to these videos and choose a model. Maybe there's an accent you particularly like, or if you're living in Liverpool or Manchester or Edinburgh, perhaps you want to sound like people from that area. It's going to improve your intelligibility if you do, right? If you live in Leeds, people are going to understand you much more clearly if you speak like someone from Leeds. Now, of course, if you don't live in the UK, then it's a different question, right? What accent do you aim towards? What model? Because if you're speaking to lots and lots of different people from all over the world, that's something else. That's a different question.
Yeah. So I guess my next question is like, how? Actually, I've tried to divide my questions into sort of sections, let's say. My first section is, what do you do, right?
So what do I do in my first lesson, for instance? Or how do I introduce this topic?
Sure, that's good. Good start.
If we have somebody that's never studied any kind of pronunciation before, firstly, you explore how your vocal tract works, and the vocal tract is from your larynx to the lips or the nose, and explore about what's happening inside your mouth. How do we create different sounds? Because this proprioception self-awareness is really important. If you don't understand what's happening inside your mouth, then it's tricky to control what you're doing. Some people find pronunciation very easy. They can listen to something and then just repeat it. But for most people, it doesn't work like that. You've got to explain how you're creating sounds in the mouth. And the first step is understanding what's happening inside your own mouth. How are we creating sounds not only in English but also in your native language? Because of course in your native language or languages, then you might find some things interesting. Okay, here are some parallels with English, here are some differences. Then we explore the relationship between spelling and sound, and we perhaps look at the student's native language, how are spelling and sound related in their native language. If, of course, their native language has a spelling system. Not all languages have orthographies, and some orthographies are more true to the pronunciation than others. English has a more etymological spelling system where we can work out relationships between words and where they came from. And of course, it's a reflection to some extent of how we pronounced words in the past, but not necessarily today.
Is there a key to helping learners understand that connection between pronunciation and spelling, or that lack of connection, perhaps?
Well, I think one great advantage one great advantage of our spelling system is that we can see words written down and notice the relationship between them. For instance, even though the pronunciation is very different, for instance, we've got photograph, but photographer. They have a different stress pattern, they have some different vowel sounds. Photo has an O in the stressed syllable, whereas photo has an O vowel, photographer. If you said those two words, somebody who wasn't familiar with English, they might not realise there's a connection between them. But the spelling shows there's a clear relationship. That's one advantage. Some people might not see it as an advantage,
of course. I think that people don't see it as an advantage. No. In fact, just from teaching students, that is definitely not an advantage because, having done all those classes about word stress where you have the table of here are the different word stress patterns. Let's put these words in the right categories across the different parts of speech. And it's photograph, first syllable, but photography and photographer. Okay, so does that mean that in the noun form, every time it's in the second syllable, is that this is what my learners are kind of thinking, oh, so they're trying to find the rule. So in the noun form, it's the second syllable, is it? Like, well, no, because in lots of plenty of other words, when you go into the noun form, the stress will be on the first syllable or somewhere else. So I don't know, what would you say in that situation to my learners who were like, teacher, Lukey, what's the rule here?
Well, I would say, look, if we spelled it exactly how we pronounce it, then it would be trickier to comprehend when you're reading. So either it's trickier to comprehend when you're reading, or it's trickier to pronounce and maybe comprehend when you're listening. That's if you want to if you want to spell them in a similar way, then you need to make compromises.
There's no way to get to escape the fact that there's an irregularity, I guess. Is that the right way to put it? You're a phonetician, is that right? Or am I right in saying that? So you're deep into the rabbit hole of phonetics and phonology and so on. So I've got to make sure I'm using the right terminology. So there is an irregularity there, and unfortunately there's just kind of no way of getting around that. But is there a key to sort of to remembering which words are stressed in which ways? Do you think?
Well, what I often teach are patterns, right? And they're always patterns rather than rules, because we have exceptions. And one common issue is that many learners of English always stress the "-ise" suffix or the "ate" suffix. And when I say stress, I mean place the primary stress on it, like in communicate or internalize, whereas we don't do that. And there are loads of words that have an "ate" or an "-ise" suffix. And not only that, but we can add suffixes on. So we have internalizing or communicated, whereas L1 speakers of English, people who grew up in England speaking English, are likely to say communicated and internalizing.
Right.
So we find these patterns that, if I find myself stressing "ate" or "-ise", it's probably not the right stress pattern.
Yeah.
However, saying that, I'm not sure how much intelligibility problems this causes in terms of the "ate" or the "-ise" suffix.
So you've said there maybe a little rule of thumb is to look for suffixes and to notice the way that suffixes will affect the stress pattern. So we don't usually stress the suffix. In fact, that's these suffixes you've just mentioned. I'm trying to think if there are other suffixes that we do stress, but anyway.
Volunteer.
Okay.
Refugee.
All right. So it's the IZE and the ATE suffixes are the ones you just mentioned. Is that right?
And with ATE, there's a simple rule. The rule is that you stress two syllables before the ATE. So we have decorate. The de is stressed because it's two syllables before ATE. In communicate, it's the same thing. So rather than, here it's the first, here it's the second, it's two syllables before ATE.
Is there a similar one with IZE?
No, it's essentially on the root, the stem of the word. So if you add "-ise", it doesn't change the stress pattern.
Okay, so internal. It's internal, a second syllable, and if you add "-ise", it doesn't do anything to the word.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. All right, but ATE, if you add that, then the stress will always, don't like that word, but no. It'll be two syllables before that suffix. So anyway, I guess for my listeners here, notice the way that certain suffixes will have an impact on the stress of a word when you change it across different parts of speech. Yeah. Yes,
and of course that pattern of two syllables before only applies to words of three syllables or more. When you have two syllable words, it's different.
Oh my gosh. I'm laughing because this to me seems like so complicated.
It does, but if you're, but it's all about developing an instinct. that you perhaps you never feel yourself stressing that ate suffix. If you're saying things like communicate, then that just doesn't feel like this accent. Yes, I'm saying appropriate for this accent or right for this accent.
Yeah.
But of course, I'm not sure how much intelligibility issues this particular suffix creates. And also, there are lots of accents in the English-speaking world, some of which will stress that ate suffix, most likely.
Really?
Well, I'm
okay. Putting you on the spot here a lot.
You are, and probably I'm going to get this wrong, but I'm thinking maybe Nigerian English might stress ate.
Right.
And then in Irish and Scottish English, you have certain words where the eyes is stressed. So in Irish English, you have realise. People don't say realise. Well, some people do, but it's very common to say realise.
Just want to say to my listeners now, I feel your pain, everyone, in the face of all these exceptions and things.
So we jumped away from the very first class, which was about exploring, and then inside your mouth, and then exploring the relationship between spelling and sound. But I wouldn't jump into complicated things like this. The idea is to find topics and patterns that are hindering intelligibility and prioritizing them. For instance, the difference between things like seat and sit, that vowel contrast has what we call a high functional load, as in there are lots of words in English that are distinguished by these vowel sounds. And if you mix them up, it's more likely to lead to intelligibility issues, more likely to lead to misunderstandings. Whereas if somebody was mixing up a TH and an F, well, that's not really a problem at all, because plenty of English speakers do that, and it causes very few intelligibility issues in general, because the sounds are very similar acoustically, and also because there are very few minimal pairs. So there's a very low functional load.
A little word of encouragement there for learners of English out there who struggle with TH sounds, right? So, for example, all my French students who struggle with that. It's not the end of the world if you don't pronounce, if you're saying 30 or 30 or something like that.
So I would always advise to go to F and V, because that's what lots of people do throughout the UK. So it's not a London thing; it's everywhere. And but saying S and Z for the two, S and Z, that can cause more intelligibility issues. Okay. So I would probably move people towards F and V, and similarly with T and D. Those are the other two. So I would advise someone not to do a T, so don't say tanks. I would advise them to go to F, thanks, if they find that really easy. Yeah,
it's difficult not to get completely caught up in very, very minute details in this conversation. I hope that everyone is able to follow everything we are saying here, Luke. Going back to a bigger question, what is a good accent?
Well, in my opinion, there's... I think you'd only use the term good accent if you were judging an actor, maybe taking on a role and putting on a particular accent and judging whether they met that criteria or not. But in my view, it's always about moving from one place towards another place. And if you are moving from having a very heavy insert language here accent, Spanish, Bulgarian, whatever accent, and you're moving towards whatever the target language variety is, whether it's standard Southern British English, which is my accent, or something else. You're moving towards that, and that will help you improve your intelligibility, improve people understanding you. But for some people, they want to sound as close to a particular accent as possible. And they may have their own reasons for this. So it's not up to the teacher to say, well, no, you're not allowed to. It's about saying, hey, well, have you thought about these alternative viewpoints? That one, it's very, very tricky to sound exactly like a so-called native speaker of this accent? And two, is it really that important? You can explore that, but regardless, somebody might have their own reasons, and that's okay.
Yeah. I spoke to David Crystal about this subject, amongst others, and he said it was really just two things: intelligibility and identity, right? And so, this might help people to think about the subject. What's the priority? Maybe both, but certainly intelligibility strikes me as being probably the first one, that you have to make sure that people can understand everything you say and that there's no room for misunderstanding. And identity, as you mentioned, is, if you decide that you want to, have a certain accent from a certain place, then, for whatever reason, because as you said, because if you live there, if you live in Leeds, you want to sound like someone from Leeds, that's the identity part. They sort of merge as well a bit, I guess. The people in Leeds are probably going to understand people who speak like them, right? So the two things do merge together, but it's a question of being understood, being clear, and then the identity stuff is up to everyone. They can just choose whatever they want to sound like. That's their choice. Okay. So what do you think should be the objective for a learner of English when considering their pronunciation?
Well, the objective is always to be understood. So if there are people listening who aren't always understood, then that's your ultimate priority. And learning about pronunciation, as we've mentioned before, helps your listening skills, because you know what sounds to listen out for. You know what word stress patterns to listen out for. If you are expecting internalize, and then you hear internalize, then you might be a bit confused. So this helps with that. And then your objective is really up to you as a learner. You can... it simply depends whether you want to sound closer to a particular accent or not. But bear in mind that there's no such thing as neutral pronunciation. If you look up a word in a dictionary, it's transcribed according to a certain accent, not some magical neutral pronunciation. And some people would argue, but they are phonemic transcriptions. So we've got a difference between phonemes and allophones. And phonemes are these abstract categories of sounds. So we've got the E vowel, like in seat, and the I vowel, like in kit. Those two are two abstract phonemes, and different accents might pronounce them in slightly different ways. But those categories will still exist. But unfortunately, not all accents have the same categories. So going back to our names, in Scotland, our names and the verb to look, well, they have the same pronunciation because those two phoneme categories don't exist. They're just one category. So dictionaries and resources textbooks are transcribing things in a particular way, and that's a particular accent. Yes, I think not all learners are aware that it's not just the pronunciation, but also the grammar that you're learning. It's a so-called standard grammar. There's no such thing as a neutral language. And so when you're learning English, you're learning the standard forms. They aren't necessarily the correct forms. They are the forms of a particular variety of English that have been chosen as the standard. So if you go to Leeds, you might find slightly different grammar. You might find slightly different vocabulary in use. Now, it's not going to vary as much as pronunciation, but I just want to drive home that there's no such thing as neutral.
Yeah, do you find that when learners come to you, there are certain sort of preconceptions or preconceptions that you need to kind of change?
It's usually I want to speak correct, and in my view, there's no such thing as correct. It's or wrong. It's simply different forms, and we can pronounce things in different ways and still be understood. But we need to perhaps separate categories like seat and sit to be understood by the vast majority of English speakers.
Because when we say a certain type of English is correct, that is suggesting that other varieties of English are somehow not correct, which is just, not true or fair.
Yes, or substandard.
Yeah. Do you think that people should prioritise pronunciation more in their learning?
I think it should be the first thing that people do before they learn any words or anything.
Yeah.
Because if you learn a word for the first time and you're unaware of how it sounds, then you're going to start pronouncing it in a certain way, and that's going to potentially lead to problems down the line in terms of intelligibility. It might not. It depends on your native language or languages, and your ability to listen. If you're listening to a lot of English, you might start learning these words in a more English way. Doing air quotes for people who can't can't see
that.
And it just makes listening so much easier. If you learn pronunciation straight away, you can just understand people more easily because you know how the words are usually pronounced. You know which categories to listen out for. If you in your native sound system you don't have a contrast between the s and c and the sh and she, you're not going to be listening out for it in English words. You'll just think, oh well, s and sh, those letters, they're just pronounced the same, and it's just weird English spelling that spells them differently. Like there's a B in debt that we don't pronounce. It's just weird English spelling. Well, actually, these are two categories that do have minimal pairs and can change the meanings of words, and so they are important to listen out for. If you're doing that from the very first lesson, then great.
Yeah, there's no such thing as weird English spelling then for you. That there are reasons behind all of those sort of what appear to be irregular forms of spelling. There are reasons for them, and actually there is a system. It's just rather complicated and not noticeable from the very beginning.
Well, I think some of the reasons for English spelling are weird, but there are reasons.
Yes,
there are reasons. It's just you might not agree with the reason why people did it. Like the scholars adding certain letters in to make it closer or show the Latin origin of words.
Yeah. But do you think that English spelling is weird? Because people do say that quite a lot, don't they? They come across, they come face to face with the language, and the conclusion is English spelling is crazy. English spelling is weird. You see lots of sort of memes and things online about how crazy and mad the English language is. What do you think as a linguist, phonetician, accent teacher?
To some extent it just hasn't been updated, whereas other languages have updated their spelling systems. It hasn't. We don't have something like there is in France and a few other countries. There's an association that apparently maintains standards, again air quotes, but they would be people who, in terms of English spelling, would have perhaps got rid of some of the irregularities. And you probably know in American English, they have got rid of some of those letters that aren't necessary. But it is. I think weird is just unfamiliar, right? Yeah. It's just unfamiliar, and to somebody who grew up in England, learning English, then yes, it's hard to begin with. But then all of these spellings just become very familiar. They're just the usual, normal way of representing the spoken word on a piece of paper or on a computer screen. So, from an average English person living in England's point of view, it's simply the way that you represent it visually.
Yes, it is a question of familiarity. And for learners of English, yeah, of course, when you first encounter a different language, it's going to seem strange and illogical. And so a lot of people will conclude that it's weird as a way of sort of like dealing with that challenge, as it were. But it's just familiarity, which again sort of goes back to that other thing, which is you've got to try and become as familiar with the language as you can and build up a relationship with it, so that when you've read enough of it and heard enough of it, that it doesn't all seem totally crazy and illogical and mad anymore. In fact, you've kind of become friends with it in a way.
What was your experience with French? French has a fairly etymological spelling system.
Maybe it's a little clearer in French, but I still think it's not entirely clear, because there are lots of letters in French that you see in words that aren't pronounced. I mean, like, ENT endings of verb conjugations, just like never mind, just don't pronounce it at all, and lots of others as well. So as a person trying to speak French and coming face to face with those what appear to be irregularities or illogical things, it can be a little bit frustrating. So I understand how it is for learners of English to be trying to get to grips with the language and find these things which are not easy to remember, or they can cause them to stumble. And it can be very frustrating and a bit annoying. But you got to just keep going. You got to carry on and try and be positive about it. Let's talk about listening. So, how can studying pronunciation help other areas of someone's English, especially listening, do you think?
Well, it improves comprehension, so your ability to understand the words and the meaning that somebody is saying. Going back to spelling, just that we were talking about earlier today, you may have heard me say something like the idea of. I caught myself doing it. I added in a r sound where there isn't one in the spelling, and that might be confusing to somebody. The idea of it. But it's something very normal that lots of people in England do. And it's not something you need to replicate. It's not obligatory. It's just something that people do, and some people do it and some people don't. But it's something that's perhaps interesting to talk about if you are listening to an English person speaking in an English class. You think, oh, there's an extra R here. You could explore why that happens, but it's probably not a priority. Well, it isn't, but it's something that might confuse an English learner. And other things. How do we divide the differences between sounds? Well, I talked about certain sh before, so there's really a continuum of sibilant type sounds that we have and that we can create in the mouth. There's no one right way to create a s or a sh, and you can try this now at home. If you make a s sound and you'll feel your tongue is more forward in your mouth, and then if you slowly bring it back in your mouth, you'll slowly go into some kind of sh type sound. Now, if you live in Spain or in Greece, maybe your type sound is somewhere on that continuum, and sometimes it might be closer to RS sound and closer to RSH sound. It might vary depending on the word, and that's because that continuum is just divided into one category in Greece, for instance, in Greek, whereas in England it's divided into two, and those are two phonemes, two abstract categories that can contrast meaning, like in she and she. Now, if you're able to do that exercise and you can hear a difference, that in the s sound there's higher frequency, there's a higher pitch, right? Whereas when you go into sh, then it starts to get deeper, lower frequencies, lower pitched. And if you can perceive that in your own vocal tracks, and as you're doing it and keep switching between the two, then you're going to find perceiving certain sh really easy. After some time, you're going to notice it. And if you become a bit obsessed with it, then you can go on to Youglish, which I'm sure your listeners know about already, and search for words like she and she, and keep listening to lots of people do it. Notice how the frequency changes, and that's just going to help you so much.
Yeah. Sort of like learning how the sounds are made in your own vocal tract can then just, help you understand how other people are doing it. Your website, you've got two. You've got your improveyouraccent.co.uk and also phonetics.com. I mean, it's very impressive, Luke, because you've found a very clear way of presenting what I think is a very complicated system. So what about phonetics.com? Can you tell me about that?
It came out of my self-imposed mission to help people speak more clearly, be understood. And when I studied languages at university and I lived abroad, and then after all of this time, I suddenly found out about phonetics and pronunciation. And I just simply hadn't been taught that there were certain vowel sounds that I could have been listening out for, that I could have been pronouncing. And that's really frustrating as a language learner. And so what I did is essentially create the platform that I want for myself. I mean, for the English one, which is the improveyouraccent.co.uk, that's just for SSBE, Standard Southern British English.
Yeah.
But my phonetics site is an ever-growing site to help people understand the sound systems of different languages, and not just different languages, but the different varieties that they will hear in that language. You'll see I've got Parisian French nasalized vowels on there, obviously in different areas of France and in Belgium and in Canada. Those nasalized vowels are pronounced differently, and there are different categories. In Paris, there's usually 3 nasalized vowels, whereas in Canada, you'll find 4, and the vowels are pronounced differently. I haven't yet got my Quebecois speaker, but at some point it'll be on there. Yeah. And this is the kind of stuff that I wanted when I was learning French at school. I clearly remember asking my teacher, well, how do you pronounce this? And she just said it and expected me to just do it. Now, some people can do it and other people can't. And if they can't, it's your job as a teacher to find a new way of explaining. And if you don't have that training, which is okay, because this is complicated stuff and not everyone is going to learn about pronunciation when they train as a teacher or phonetics or go into this much detail. But if you have a learner, or you yourself are a learner, and you're looking for resources for languages other than English, then check back regularly at phonetics.com.
And it's spelled phonetics, F-U-N.
Because there
E-T.
is fun in there.
Yeah, absolutely there is. Yeah. But I like the way that you do take a very clear step-by-step approach to doing it. It's, like nicely uncluttered website, which really helpfully portions out the information in such a way as not to overwhelm people with pronunciation. I think that's maybe one of the problems, is that it can be a bit overwhelming, especially when you look at like for my learners of English in a classroom, when we get into pronunciation and I then refer to the phonemic chart, which is on the board, on the wall, then I get the impression that a lot of them are like, oh God, what, I've got to learn another alphabet. Yeah,
and something to be aware of is that phonemic alphabet system is, of course, of a particular accent. Yeah. Also, that you don't have to learn it. It's just a tool that you might find helpful. And I suggest, on my website, there is a free tool. You can go on and you've got an interactive chart with those symbols, and you can click and you can listen to example words. And I've got minimal pairs on there. And a great thing to do is to go on to not Google anymore, but to go on to bing.com, the search engine that very few people use or have heard of, and type in define plus the word. So if you type in define plus the word debt, you'll probably get some debt advertisement, but you'll also see some data from the Oxford Dictionary, and it will show you the word, the definition, and the phonemic transcription, and then there's an audio button. So every time you look up a word and I suggest always doing it online so you can listen, then look at the phonemic transcription. So if you play the word debt, you won't hear a B, and you'll see 3 symbols, de, et. And over time, you'll start to get a bit more familiar with those symbols, and then you'll come across a word and you don't recognize the symbol, and you realize that sound is actually, you can't make it. So then perhaps you go to my website or a different site that has a chart and you can listen to it, and then you think, okay, that's what the sound is. These are the words it appears in. Maybe I'll ask my teacher how to pronounce it, or how I can move from my current pronunciation to the new one.
Very good. So, listeners, that's phonetics.com, phonetics.com, and then improveyouraccent.co.uk, which is for learning English.
Yes, and that one, if you go to learning resources on my site, you'll find the vowel and consonant chart, among other resources that are free.
I see. Okay. All right. Okay.
And I should just say something else about the phonemic chart, is that most learners, to improve their communication, they don't need to learn all of these symbols or all of these sounds, because probably they're pronouncing a lot of them correctly or appropriately already. It's not that a lot of speakers can already pronounce an M sound. So you don't need to learn how to make it if you can already pronounce it at the beginning, in the middle, at the end of a syllable. Obviously, some speakers will find it tricky at the ends of syllables, but
how would someone? I mean, how do you go about improving your accent if you're learning another language? So, are you working on a particular language at the moment?
So I have done this step by step in phonetics.com about how to go about it. It's essentially, checking you understand how things work in your mouth. Then I would strongly advise that you do learn some IPA symbols, so International Phonetic Alphabet symbols, because that's going to really help you. And then go on to a site like Wikipedia, which is usually very good for linguistic stuff, and search for instance, French phonology or Portuguese phonology, and you'll go down and you'll see a table with the IPA sounds, and some of them you'll recognize, some of them not, and then you can click on them and you can listen to them and listen to example words and work out how they're pronounced. Now, I'm very aware that we've only talked about sounds, and pronunciation is more than sounds, right? We've got the segmentals, vowels and consonants, but we also have the suprasegmentals. And so you might also be interested in rhythm, intonation, all of that stuff. That's a whole other minefield.
Yeah, I mean, you've talked about sort of like identifying where you're actually having issues, rather than deciding to learn all of the pronunciation of a particular language, but sort of identifying the bits that you have trouble with and working on those. How do you find out the bits that you're having trouble with?
Well, I'll just take you through Vietnamese. So Vietnamese I chose because it has loads of really interesting sounds. That's the primary reason. It sounds really cool. It's a great reason to try and learn it. It's also written using the Roman alphabet with modifications, which makes it very easy to read. It's got quite a fairly transparent spelling to sound relationship. So once you've learned what sounds those letters represent, then it's fairly easy to pronounce it. You've also got reasonably good resources online which tell you about the different varieties of Vietnamese and how sounds, vowels, consonants, but also tones are pronounced differently in different accents. So that's great. And then I know that English doesn't have tones, so that's something to work on. I know from reading and listening that Vietnamese tones aren't just about pitch, it's also about the quality of your voice. So in English, it doesn't really matter if we make a sound like this if it's breathy, or if we make sounds like this, which is creaky. But if in Vietnamese, those are kind of linked with tones, with pitch movements. So you also need to listen out for these voice qualities as well. So just having all that information, and I guess I already know how to change pitch and do different voice qualities, but that gave me an instant head start in learning the language, because I could parse words, I could understand what these words were and write them down. I could pronounce words, Now, I can't speak very fluently at all. I don't have a very good knowledge, but that's simply due to lack of practice and motivation. But my pronunciation isn't bad. So when I go to a Vietnamese restaurant and I order in Vietnamese, the waiter is somewhat surprised that the tones are in the right place. And one time I went to a Vietnamese restaurant and asked for the bill, and I can't remember how I say it now, but the Vietnamese waiter turned to me and said, "You know I can speak English, right?"
If they switch to English, they're like, I don't want to carry on doing this in this bad version of my language.
Yes. But it just means that whenever you learn a new word, you're learning it with the speaker's, the usual pronunciation in your mind. Rather than your own pronunciation, which is influenced by your own sound system.
Yeah.
So if I learned the word, if I learned, I don't know, the word tent as something like ta, because I was following the spelling to sound rules of French, I'm going to find it quite tricky to recognize tent.
When you're listening to, me having a conversation with someone who's just come back from a festival, and I said, "How was the festival?" And they said, "It was awful. I had to stay in a tent the whole time." And the French person said, "Il dit quoi?" They don't understand, because this would never happen because tent is such a well-known word. But learning the pronunciation. Yeah, basically, I guess for the listeners, don't forget about the pronunciation. It's so important.
And be aware that the way things are spelled in your language isn't necessarily reflective of the pronunciation in another language. In French, when you have an N followed by a vowel, it often nasalizes the vowel beforehand, and you don't pronounce the N or the M if it's word final, for instance.
Yeah.
Whereas in English, you do. So when you see words like ten and tent, that N has to be pronounced, and the vowel doesn't have the same nasalized quality as it does in French.
You have a very sort of technical understanding of all of this, right? Now,
which of course can be a disadvantage for the person listening to me.
Well, yeah, because we are getting an insight into all the things in your head. And for the uninitiated, it's like wandering into Aladdin's cave, and it's like, wow, so many things, and we can't really make head nor tail of it. For you, it's all ordered. It's like a very, very, very well ordered office with all the shelves and the office furniture all ordered and all these things categorized. But for us, we're like, whoa, where do we start?
And what I say is exactly like learning English vocabulary or grammar. It's really confusing. You're completely overwhelmed at the beginning. What are these irregular tenses, tense endings we have to learn? Why is it sing, sang, sung and not singed, for instance? That's really confusing. I can't get my head around it. And then suddenly you become a bit more familiar with it and everything becomes easier. And it's exactly the same with pronunciation. Anytime you approach a new topic, a new area, a new field, it's going to be overwhelming. There are going to be new terms. There are going to be new things that you have to learn. It doesn't mean it's more complicated than other things you've learned in your life. To me, everything seems fairly simple. You're pronouncing this in this way. It makes complete sense. You're just following a pattern. Perhaps it's a pattern from your native language or another language you speak. We just need to change this pattern, and then once you're aware of it and you can replicate it, then you will hopefully develop an instinct, and you will replicate that pattern, that changed pattern, in every word you say that has that particular sound. Like, for instance, at one point in time, you learned the verb look, and its past tense looked, and you had to really remember it for your English tests. Now, you probably don't need to think about it. Well, it's the same with pronunciation. You just need to become familiar with it. And in class, yes, I do talk about these technical things, but not everyone responds to it. And your job as a teacher is to work out the learning style and to work out what they respond to. And so if they don't respond to any of that stuff, then you just need to find a different way. So it's not that I insist on my system, because of course it's a system that doesn't work for everyone.
Yeah. So for those people who I mean, I'm sort of like, herding, I'm like shepherding my listeners here, and there's like some of my flock, let's say. I don't know if it's fair to compare them to sheep, but anyway, let's just go with the metaphor. So some of my flock are there. They're in the pen. They're with you. They're like, yes, he's speaking my language. I love all of this science. And the categorizing and the patterns. And
they love the vowel alternation between sheep and shepherd.
Exactly. Yeah. This is wonderful, and I could just yum yum yum. I could just eat this all day. And they're categorizing it already, and they're thinking in the same way as you. And then there's my other people in my flock, other sheep, who are just wandering off, and they're just like, I can't deal with this. I'm just going to go and eat some grass over here. This is too much. And so what are the ways in which we can corral those other people? The metaphor, I'm breaking them. I'm stretching the metaphor. But how can we deal with those people who don't think in the same way as you, and who struggle to deal with the different, with the complexity of it?
Well, I mean, you could also use metaphor. That how does it feel when you speak in your native language, and now try speaking in your native language but with a really strong English accent, because you're not going to feel very self-conscious if you're speaking in your own native language. So for instance, you might say, where is the bus station, in your native language, and then in an English accent in your native language. How does that feel different? What adjectives can we use to describe that difference in feeling? How does it sound different? Can we replicate that? Some people like... you can also, it's not just about feelings, but also maybe metaphors of movement. Which accents seem like someone is kind of going like this. I need to describe it now for the podcast listeners, like slashing, essentially.
Slashing as if they've got a sword in their hand, and they are fighting against a pirate that's attacking them, and you would slash diagonally in front of you with the sword.
Which accents feel like they move like that, or what languages feel that they move like that in terms of their rhythm, I'm talking about here, really. And then which accents feel like you're on a boat on a very calm sea, that there's a gentle rock. Which accents feel like you're sprinting 100 meters, and which accents feel like you're having a leisurely walk in the park. So these metaphors can help unlock things and lead to things.
By giving visual sort of connecting them to visual things, or to connecting them to, as you said, proprioception, like physical feelings and movements and things like that. Yeah, really interesting, thinking outside the box.
And whenever I'm teaching a sound, it's always about using your senses. So if you have trouble with the English R sound, for instance, and be aware there are different types of R sound in the English-speaking world, but if you're learning my type of R sound, like in carry, for instance, then we might feel what's happening in the mouth. How does it feel different from your R type sound? And then we might get a mirror and open up the jaw, hold it open with your hand, look in the mirror. What's happening with your tongue? How is it moving? Can you see what it's doing? And how is it different from the R in your native language, if you have an R type sound, of course? And then how does it sound? So how does it sound different to your native R type sound? Because if you're not using all of your senses, it's going to be quite tricky. Because you need to physically produce it, right? It's not something that we can just put on a piece of paper like grammar tables. This is something that we need to embody in order to use it in spontaneous speech. And using our senses helps us do that.
It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating, Luke. And again, putting myself in the position of this shepherd character who's kind of like trying to help all of my listeners keep up with us and benefit from this. Do you have any sort of how can I put it, sort of bite-sized, digestible, quick tips? And
I have to say that most that what I want to drive home, I know I've used this idiom multiple times today.
Go ahead.
What I want to drive home is that you don't need to learn all the sounds of English. You might not need to learn all the intonation patterns of English or the rhythm of English. You might be doing it already. You probably are. So it's about finding the sounds that cause issues in intelligibility. That's what your priority is. So whenever somebody asks you to repeat, then maybe write that word down in your phone, and then when you get home, look on bing.com and listen to it and look at the phonetic transcription. Are there any sounds there that perhaps you're finding tricky? And ask your teacher, am I pronouncing this word in a way that other people would understand? I should just add a caveat to that, is that when somebody doesn't understand you and asks you to repeat, it might not be you. It might be that they are hungry and thinking about their lunch. It might be that it's a noisy environment. There are loads of issues that affect comprehensibility.
Yes.
So it might not be you. But if you're finding a pattern, every time you say a word with a V in, somebody doesn't understand, well, hey, that's something to work on, and ask your teacher, or take a look at my website and work out how it's created.
Or like me, when I order water, I order my lunch without any problem. But then when it comes to asking for the water or a jug of water, that the waiter or waitress always goes, huh? What? Then, like me, I need to work out how to pronounce the O sound in water. Do you speak French?
Very badly.
Okay,
but that vowel in O is a monophthong. So a lot of, not you, but a lot of people from England, when they're learning French, will just say oh, and that's a moving sound. It's a diphthong. It moves from one point and glides towards another point. Oh. And if you can't feel it, do another diphthong like I. And if you look at that in the mirror, you'll see your tongue moving or your jaw moving from down to up. Yeah. Whereas in French, that vowel, at least in standard Northern Metropolitan French, is just a monophthong.
Yeah.
And also it's fairly centralized, which means it's made more central in the mouth. So it's not quite like the vowel sound that we have in the word thought, which is something like or, which is further back. Or.
Yeah. Yeah. So I need to identify that vowel sound and just practice it, work on it, maybe go onto phonetics.com and have some fun with that. Yeah, or just drink beer every time.
Yes.
Maybe this is the solution. I'm not sure actually if that is the solution. Genuinely, it's been really, really interesting talking to you. I hope that my listeners are okay.
But we can do a section of like fairly simple things.
Sure, go ahead.
Just in case when you're editing, it just becomes really complicated and you think, we need to cut a load of this.
Yeah, but I don't know if you've heard,
some people
don't know if you've heard my podcast, a lot of episodes, but I quite regularly will, I don't know if it's impose, but present complicated, probably quite confusing, fairly long conversations for my audience to listen to. Some people can't do it. Other people love it. And so I might not edit that much, I might just kind of leave it natural to an extent. I mean, I don't mean just not bother editing. I'll definitely do that if it's needed. But I think that, I do often present my audience with conversations like this that might leave them a bit confused. I don't know. There must be some method to my madness, but
and I think there is maybe a gap for people talking about pronunciation at a slightly more complicated level.
Yeah, hopefully see,
and maybe teachers as well, right? I imagine that a lot of people that listen to your podcast are English teachers.
Absolutely, yes. I do have a lot of English teachers and a lot of advanced listeners as well who are probably interested in this whole world, just sort of, and then another thing that I try to do is, in the midst of these potentially confusing conversations, add a human element that hopefully sort of is the spoonful of sugar that
Yes.
allows the medicine to go down. So hopefully, listeners, that you've managed to carry on with those little spoonfuls of sugar. I don't know if there have been that many, but I don't mean to kind of take anything away from you, Luke, because I'm incredibly impressed by the depth of your knowledge, and not only that, but obviously the sort of flexibility you have as a teacher in being able to, find clever ways to allow your learners to understand, the relationship between the sounds and the mouth and
that's the job
word.
of every teacher. I don't think it's something. It's just what every teacher should do, or what makes somebody a reasonably good teacher.
Yeah, I mean, as teachers, what we are dealing with a fairly complicated thing. Helping other people learn a language is a seriously complex thing. So yeah, we both have experience of trying to think outside the box in order to make that as easy as possible. But having said that, nevertheless it is very impressive that you have amassed such detailed understanding of pronunciation, not just in English, but clearly internationally and across many different languages and so on. Do you? What about your Vietnamese then? Where are you with that?
Oh yeah, I took a year of Vietnamese lessons regularly, and it was great fun. It's just tricky when you don't live within a Vietnamese community. The motivation is hard. To get that up, right? Because I don't need it for my job. I don't need it for my day-to-day communication, and therefore it's a luxury that I really enjoy. And sometimes life events happen, and then you just let it slip. So I absolutely want to get back to it. I think it's almost like I'm a kid in a sweet shop, that there are so many cool languages that I want to spend time learning. That what's the idiom? Master of none.
Yeah. It's jack of all trades, master of none. You can't bite off more than you can chew.
So I can talk about the sounds of most major languages. I
was actually going to ask you. Actually, you mentioned maybe we can finish with this. Some sort of simple, specific things. What are some of the most common things that you deal with? What are the most common things that come up in your lessons that you spend a bit of time on, do you think? So I guess living in London, you have multinational groups, don't you? So it's harder to find such common things. I mean, living in France, obviously I get the same old things again and again. But yeah, your students come from all over the world. So yeah, it may be harder to find those regular things that always come up. But I don't know. Do you have anything in mind?
Well, the things are having no idea how the mouth works and how we create sounds. Everyone needs to go through that process of understanding what your tongue is doing when you're creating new sounds. And the other thing is the relationship between spelling and sound in English. You just need to forget that writing, writing is writing, speaking is speaking, and they are different things. They're used for different purposes. And so when you see something written down, don't assume that's the way it's pronounced. Mm-hmm. It's not a very helpful guide. And as soon as you start divorcing that relationship, as soon as you realize that the way words are spelled aren't always the way they are pronounced, then you start listening differently, and you can pick up on certain things. Okay, I didn't realize that they said compartment rather than compartment, things like this. Or okay, there's some stress on that syllable in photographer and the vowel is O, but in photograph it's stressed on the first and there's an O vowel, but from the spelling they're both the letter O. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't guess from the spelling. No, you wouldn't. But as soon as you make peace with the fact that English spelling isn't exactly how we pronounce. As soon as you're happy with that idea, then you won't get frustrated. You'll just accept it and start to improve.
Okay. All right. Do you want to talk to me a little bit, just as I said just before we finish, about, I mean, again, you could go on about this for many hours, but about the different parts of the mouth. How many different parts of the mouth are involved in speaking English, let's say, in speaking the version of English that I think we both speak?
Well, rather than the number of different parts, maybe I'll just mention some parts that are involved, because I suppose there's kind of so many different muscles and other bits that we could talk about. But in general, the bits that we use to create sounds, the simple bits, the tongue. So if you make a T sound at home, like in Tom or 10, and then you make a K sound, like in can or Kent, the place in England, if you keep doing those two sounds, maybe you can feel that one part of the tongue is used for one sound and another part is used for the other sound. And you might realize, you can pause the podcast now if you haven't worked it out, but that the T sound is made with the very front of the tongue, whereas the K is made with the back of the tongue. And if you look in a mirror, you'll need to hold your jaw open as you do this. If you look in a mirror, then you can... I'm just saying, Luke, find a mirror. You'll need to hold your jaw open. So literally take your hand and hold it open. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. What am I doing? T and k.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can see that difference. And so that's showing you, it's giving you a visual image in your mind of what's actually happening in your mouth. Just be aware that not everyone makes these sounds in the same way. So you will get lots of French speakers, for instance, who will make a T sound with the tongue tipped down, but it will still be the kind of the front of the tongue going up. So the tip of the tongue will be behind the teeth. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, we use the lips. So when we make a W sound in English, the lips are rounded and pushed forwards. When we say things like when, why, the lips are pushed forwards, and it's like you're saying an ooh type sound, like in the word school. Then we have nasal consonants. So if you make a long M sound, and then you close your nose, so you use your fingers to close off your nostrils, you'll find out that it's quite challenging to make an M with your nostrils closed. Because
it feels like your head is inflating.
Yeah, because the air has nowhere to go. Because normally the air goes through the nose for that M sound. And the bit that controls that is called the velum, or the soft palate at the back of your mouth. And it's like a valve, and it opens to let air through the nose, and it closes for when sounds are just made through the mouth.
Mm-hmm. 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 Very interesting. Very interesting indeed.
And then, of course, the other major one is the larynx, which is also known as the voice box. And that's the bump in your neck. So you'll feel a bump regardless of whether you're male or female. But if you are born male, then your larynx might be slightly larger. And if you make a z sound, you'll feel vibrations. And if you make a s sound, you won't.
Yeah. Okay. It's very interesting. Thank you so much for talking to me and my audience all about this stuff. And what can people do if they want to kind of find out more and delve deeper?
You can go to my website, improveyouraccent.co.uk, where you'll find free learning resources. If you want to delve into phonetics and this conversation was far too easy for you, then you'll find a list of recommended books. But if you're looking simply to improve your pronunciation, then I have an online course which is designed according to your native language, so things are prioritized according to what you need to learn, and there are also classes with me, and the course got to the final of the British Council Eltons Awards, and then if you're interested in phonetics in general, then go to phonetics.com. That's phonetics with fun at the beginning.
Okay, fantastic. Great. Well, lunchtime now. I'm going to try and order some water with my lunch. We'll see what happens. Okay, great. Well, yeah, have a lovely day. Great to speak to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, pleasure. All right, thanks so much.
I wanted to say I didn't ask you anything about your pronunciation teaching and what you find works and doesn't work. It was a lot of me talking.
It's fine. Having been out of the classroom now for 2.5 months, it's hard for me to just instantly recall those moments. And pronunciation for me is always mixed in with the other bits of teaching and stuff. But yeah, I mean, what happens with me is that it always ends up devolving into comedy when I do pronunciation teaching, which actually works really, really well. And it's actually one of my most favourite things to do in the classroom. On the other hand, doing this, podcasting, it's so much harder to teach pronunciation through my podcast. Which perhaps is not what people might expect, because this is all about the spoken word. But in fact, I find that in order to really help my students, I've got to be there. They've got to be right there in front of me, and I've got to be with them. I've got to be listening to them, reacting to them all the time. And yeah, that's fantastic fun and extremely engaging for the students. So yeah, my experience of teaching pronunciation is it's very fun and extremely funny as well. Especially when, you know, you're trying to kind of work on a specific thing and it starts to get a bit abstract, where you take this thing away from the normal mechanics and normal social dynamics of a conversation, you know, and you end up in this weird world of pronunciation, and people feel awkward, people feel embarrassed about it, but it can be terrifically funny. For example, you know, if you know you're making them make funny sounds, you're making them stick their tongue out, or you know, feel different parts of their face or their throat or something. You're making them put a pen in their mouth, and yeah, that can be really great in the classroom. So without being as specific as you, just talking about the experience of it, I would say that it's a wonderful thing to teach.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, though. You need to lower inhibitions to get people to pronounce weird and wonderful sounds. And as you mentioned before, sometimes it's linked to identity, that they feel if they pronounce this weird sound, people are going to judge them or think of them as someone different to who they are. But once you give yourself permission as a learner to sound different, because you're already sounding different. If you're using words that are English words that you didn't say when you were a child, then you already sound different. And in my view, speaking another language is part of your identity. You are somebody who can communicate with lots of different people. You've put in that time to learn a new language. I think that's amazing. And that is something to be proud of and is part of your identity. Now, whether you want to sound exactly like a native speaker, native in air quotes, speaker, that's another thing. But creating new sounds, you'll probably have to do this if you want people to understand you.
I've said on this show before that everyone has the right to have English, you know, just talking to people learning English. It's not necessarily like this other thing that you don't necessarily, it's not yours. And so you don't want to get it wrong. You don't want to offend the people who own this language. Well, everyone has English. You're welcome to it, and thinking of it in that way may help to get over certain mental barriers about, that trepidation that you have about, I don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to pronounce it wrong. Just go for it. It's all right. Just own it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's no right or wrong in my view. It's simply about, can everyone understand you? And if you have some phonetic training, you can also adjust the way you speak. I sometimes adjust the way I speak to make things easier for people to understand me.
Yeah.
And that's using English in an international context. which is, sometimes I will add an R into a word so that people who are expecting to hear an R will understand me.
Yeah. Do you like to do accents yourself for fun? I mean, obviously you love the linguistics of it and decoding it and everything, but I mean, for me personally, I'm also a comedian and I like to fool around a lot, and I like to do impressions and voices and things, and that's great fun. I mean, I like to do accents in English accents. Do you take that approach too? Do you like to do you have fun doing, let's say, impressions of different accents or what?
Yeah, I guess I find it really fun to play around in my own vocal tract and create new sounds and imitate different accents. I think whether you do that publicly or not depends on power structures and depends on what your role is at that time, right? So if you're a comedian, you've kind of got a bit of free reign. If you're someone else, well, it depends. You need to read the room.
Yeah, of course, yeah. You can't just be at a party just doing different accents, because that's just not the right time or place for it. But if you're on stage as part of a comedy show and you've found a way to incorporate different accents into humour, and you've got actual jokes involved and stuff like that, then that's probably more appropriate. Although, having said that, there are comedians that we know who have in the past done different accents on stage, and it's been considered completely socially unacceptable. And that's another story, the politics of which accents, if like certain people do certain accents, that this is really an incorrect thing to do. But yeah, so I guess maybe what you're saying is that in private you will kind of maybe have fun with different accents. Yes. Yeah, me too. Yeah. Okay. Are you good at doing different accents?
I would say I'm better than a lot of people, but I wouldn't say I was the best at it. But Dead Ringers was my favourite show growing up on the radio and then also on TV.
For those that don't know, it's an impressions show with some excellent comedians, like John Colshaw, I think, was in Dead Ringers. He's
still in it.
He's still in it, really, an English impressionist. Amazing, right? I mean, impressionists are incredible.
And something I mentioned before about different movements, well, they've done brain scans of impressionists, and they've shown that the movement part of your brain lights up when you're doing an impression. And I'm not talking about the movement of the tongue, etc., but kind of whole body movements. And this makes complete sense to me. When I embody another accent, I am doing that. I am getting into a different zone. And that's what I talk about with my students. You need to find that English zone, whatever that is for you, and it's going to feel different. But again, it's about how far do you want to go? It's up to you.
That's very interesting. So you're saying that that when impressionists do different accents, the parts of the brain responsible for body movement are active, which suggests that. Again, this is actually very reassuring for me, because I've said this to my learners a lot as well, which is that speaking English, it's not just about your mouth. In fact, it's about your whole body. And you've got to try and do it with your whole body. And that doesn't mean jumping up and down and stuff, but more just, feeling like the language, you're expressing the language with everything. That's a hard thing to perhaps get across to some people. But whenever I'm modelling English and asking them to repeat sentences after me to work on sentence stress or something like that, I do find that I start moving my shoulders, I maybe move forwards for certain things, my arms, my hands come into play. That doesn't mean gesticulating madly like a crazy person when you speak, but it means that English is not just like this abstract thing, just these words that just come out of the front of your face, but you kind of express them with everything, with your whole body, like an actor would. And
of course, in terms of just jumping into a specific thing, if you find that you are moving your body on unstressed syllables, then it's probably you haven't quite embodied it yet. If you're trying to say a word and you can't get the stress right, then you need to move your whole body or your arm on the stressed syllable and actually look to see if you're moving on the right one. Because I do this exercise all the time, and you'll find people moving on the unstressed one, and they think they've stressed it right. And just look at yourself and see where you're moving. You're moving on a different one.
Yeah, you can sort of like encourage learners to move the bodies up or down for intonation patterns, so but, that sort of thing. And yeah, I find when I'm doing those, let's call them drills, those pronunciation, listen and repeat exercises, that as I exaggerate to try and, help them, that I end up with these exaggerated physical movements, and it's like moving my body up and down and moving my eyebrows up and down. A lot of eyebrow stuff. I don't know if you've noticed that, but I find there's like eyebrows for some reason come into it. So if it's like, polite requests and, for some reason the eyebrows go up and down as well. And I really think that if learners can unlock the physical side, it can really help them get into the way the sounds happen as well. So, yeah, think about the whole attitude. And that's interesting, like when you're speaking Japanese. I used to live in Japan and I learned some Japanese. And I found that when I spoke Japanese, I would move like a Japanese person. It's like different sort of, totally different kind of movement. And when French people speak, there's a sort of a French body language as well.
And there's also the paralinguistic sounds, the sounds that aren't words, but that you make when engaging in conversation.
Yes.
And often Japanese ladies will make something like, right? And that is something like, in English.
Yeah. Yeah. The Japanese are incredible. The different noises they make. There's like, the heh and ho as well, which is a personal favourite of mine.
And so you're demonstrating excellent voice quality changes in your larynx.
Yeah, that's if only I could somehow convert my ability to make sounds and do impressions into effective learning of a second language. I think that, I feel like I'm only like one or two steps away from combining these things and suddenly, realizing all of this latent language learning ability. What did you call those things? Those sounds that are made that aren't words again?
Paralinguistic, kind of away from the linguistic bit.
Right. In French, they have those things too, like, ba, for example. Is one of those, which I think, what? You became a sheep for a second. What's going on? The sheep are back, Luke. I told you I was a shepherd. And in English as well, obviously we have which is a big one. Do we have others? Mm-hmm. 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 Mm. Oh yeah, all you need to do is listen to lots of podcasts and you'll hear them.
Yeah.
Huh? All those noises, yeah.
And there's a difference between oh and ooh. So we use these different vowels for,
Yeah, oh and oh as well, which is like disappointment. Yeah. And then in different parts of the country, those sounds are slightly different. Like if you go to Liverpool, it'll be
Yes.
Which is interesting. Is it just Liverpool, or are there other places that have different ones?
Yeah, so these are called hesitation sounds, and they're a great way to get into the zone of a different language or language variety, a different accent, because this is where your mouth is when it's at rest. When my mouth is at rest, my settings in my mouth are in a certain place, and when I vocalize, it sounds like whereas when you're in Liverpool, it's eh. And this can help you find that zone, that shape of the accent you're going for in your mouth. Yes, other people will have different ones. It depends. You can tell me what the French one is. I'm sure you.
Bah.
And also,
yeah, definitely. Interesting. Liverpool, Spain, like what happened? It's just a coincidence, I suppose.
It's basically loads of languages that have as their.
Right,
it's
right.
either or ah. But English is a bit strange in that it has an sound for it, because not many languages have Well, there are languages, but not loads.
Yeah. Okay. I think we should probably end the conversation now,
Yeah,
because
otherwise
we
too much
sort of
editing.
tried to end it earlier, and then you were like, "No, I need to ask Luke about his teaching experiences too," which was good. But I think it's probably time to call it a day, call it quits now. But great, Luke. Thanks a lot again.
Yeah, thanks for the chat.
Yeah, indeed, and all the best. And hope to speak to you again sometime.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Cheers.
Take care. Bye.